Hello, everyone. It's exciting to be back with the Resistance Bureau. This is our first show in 2022, and we're very excited because it's focusing on such a timely subject. The Resistance Bureau continues to bring you critical issues around democracy, human rights, and the broader struggle for freedom, not just in Africa, but across the world. My name is Mandatum Lodwa. I'm your host today, and I'm co-hosting with my colleague, Jeffrey Smith. Jeff, a lot of our followers have been asking when we're bringing the next show, so I'm very excited. Isn't it really exciting that we're bringing it back to them?
Mentare, it's fantastic. I'm energized and ready to go. So let's get started.
Thank you so much for joining me. So, just as a way of refreshing everyone's memory, the Resistance Bureau, like I already mentioned, focuses on those major threats to democracy, election, human rights, and the broader struggle for human freedom. So, in this show, we feature leading voices that are at the forefront of this critical fight. You have your activists, your thought leaders, your human rights defenders. We seek to build a solidarity among them. So, this year, we're expanding beyond Africa, focusing on global issues, but obviously reflecting on what those issues mean to the continent and how African activists and leaders are actually responding to them. It is against this backdrop that we're bringing you today a stellar lineup of experts that are helping us unpack this critical question: what are the drawbacks of doing business with dictators? Our lineup today includes Dr. Ania Nishat, an international human rights expert who has worked on Russian-related issues for over decades. We're also joined by Vava Tamba, a Congolese social justice activist whose work focuses on peace building in Africa's Great Lakes region. We are also joined by Godba Tumushabe, a lawyer and accomplished researcher in Uganda. Last but not least, we are joined by Rula Jibril, a best-selling author and foreign policy analyst with expertise on modern-day dictators. At the end of our session, we have our discussion, and it's going to be joined by the discussant Sarah Leah Watson, a pro-democracy advocate and executive director of Democracy for Arab World Now, who will be joining our friend Nick Chisman at the end of the questions. So continue to send us your questions. They will also bring in questions from their own academic research. So we encourage everyone that's listening to the show to follow us on Twitter right now at Resist Bureau and to use the hashtag Resist Bureau Live. We're currently live streaming on YouTube as well as on Facebook, and we're recording this show for later distribution. So just before we go to our speakers for the discussion, I would love for you to set the scene for us.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Mentare. Like I said, it's amazing to be back on the air with you, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm really looking forward to hearing from today's diverse panel of experts. As Mentare mentioned, we are turning our attention today to the ongoing Russian invasion of its democratic neighbor, Ukraine. The daily images of bloodshed and tragedy, including the deliberate bombing of civilian targets, has shocked people around the world. As outrage now turns to analysis, people are asking whether Western governments, including leaders of democratic nations, appeased Vladimir Putin and his brand of aggressive authoritarianism for too long. For example, wasn't Putin's repression of his own people, including the repeated assassinations of political opponents both at home in Russia and abroad, clear evidence of violations of human rights? Wasn't the annexation of Crimea and the prior invasions of Georgia and Donbas evidence of his disregard for international laws and norms? And clearly, in places as diverse as Moldova and Syria, Putin got away with his crimes scot-free. Why is that? And many African activists working under the stresses of authoritarian rule have been asking similar questions about their own leaders. What have diplomatic deals signed by Western powers, often inked in the name of so-called stability, done to improve respect for human rights? Is it time to stand up to dictators before we see further abuses in countries like Russia, Rwanda, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and beyond? I'm sure that many, if not all, these countries will come up in our discussion today. There's also more direct connection between what is happening in Ukraine today and the struggles for freedom across Africa. Putin's regime is seeking greater leverage in several African nations today, including Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, and Sudan, by providing military and security assistance. This will likely strengthen the hand of authoritarian leaders and merely encourage them to follow similar strategies of repression. Today, we will seek to unpack these complex issues and hopefully arrive at some possible answers as to how authoritarian leaders can be prevented from spreading and multiplying their oppression beyond their borders. Of course, an integral part of this program is you, our audience. So to be part of the discussion, send us your questions on WhatsApp. The number is +263 77 623 8199. If you did not catch that, the number is also available right now on both our Twitter and Facebook pages. We very clearly have a busy agenda, Mentare, so back to you to kickstart today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for setting that scene. Dr. Anya, I'm just going to bring you in here. You've extensively studied and worked in Russia over the years. How do you view the situation in Ukraine, and what does it tell us about Putin's regime and how it aims to build and expand its power?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I will start by saying, I would say what it is not. And unfortunately, it is not shocking. I'm not suggesting that an aggressive war in the middle of Europe against one of Russia's neighbors is not shocking. Of course it is. But it is perhaps not shocking for people like me who have been watching Russia and Putin's regime reach that stage. It did not start on February 24th. It did not start last year or 2 years before. It started pretty much from the moment when Putin first took power. It started with the war in Chechnya. Jeff, you mentioned several other conflicts, the annexation of Crimea, Georgia, but I do believe that we should go back, first of all, to the war in Chechnya, because when I look at the scenes from Kharkov and Kiev these days, the first thing it reminds me of is the devastation that Russia caused in Chechen capital Grozny and then all over the Chechen Republic. And I'll try to be brief, although it's a big subject, and I'm very glad that you, the way you framed this discussion, because it's not just about Russia and how Russia internally allowed this to reach that stage, but it's also about the reaction from the rest of the world over the last 2 decades that I think has contributed to what we're facing today. And I'm saying it as somebody who documented human rights violations in Chechnya, which I just mentioned, and then in Georgia, and then in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and also in Syria, in all of which Russia has used very similar tactics to what we're seeing today. And the world did know about it. Yes, it was not as well covered on social media as what we're seeing now, but it would be absolutely untrue to suggest that it was happening in silence. I personally, after each of those trips on the ground, would go to Brussels and Strasbourg and Washington and Paris and London and put all these evidence in front of diplomats and international institutions. And there was always an explanation / an excuse. First, Russia was, it was Russia's internal problem, and foreign governments didn't want to interfere in Russia's internal business. Second, Russia became a partner in the global war on terror. Eventually, the idea was to engage in soft diplomacy and even financial support, which was believed to be the only way to not isolate Russia, and so on and so forth. The explanation was always different, but it was always an excuse for inaction. And I think we're now witnessing the horrendous fruits, consequences of this policy. Let me stop here for an introduction, and I'm very happy to pick it up at any point in the discussion.
Precise, insightful context, Dr. Neustadt. As mentioned in today's intro, and you alluded to this, Putin's invasion of Ukraine is yet another wake-up call to Russia's attempts to export its authoritarian governance model, and this includes in parts of Africa, again, as we discussed at the outset. And you mentioned this culture of impunity and the fact that you were speaking at all these venues and nothing seemed to be done about this. No momentum was really gained there. And there's been a lot of talk recently about sanctions and how these can sometimes work, but very clearly, as we're witnessing even today, this hasn't stopped Putin's rockets from falling from the skies, right? So aside from the sanctions already applied to Putin, his backers, and the oligarchs, in your opinion and in your line of work and what you have seen, what other options really exist today to hold Putin accountable, and also, really importantly for this discussion, to prevent future atrocities?
Thank you. I was always, my entire life, a big proponent of measures that would help overcome the Security Council's veto. And normally, if we were talking about another country, I would probably have said the same, that there is actually a way for the international community to overcome the veto through the General Assembly, that more United Nations General Assembly, that more power needs to be given to this body, which is much more representative than a Security Council, where vetoes have been used for political reasons for decades now. But unfortunately here, we are dealing with a nuclear power. We are dealing with a nuclear power who's currently led by a leader who is absolutely clearly out of control. It's not even the Putin that we knew 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think he's isolated, he's paranoid, he doesn't trust even his closest allies internally. And so I think he's relatively unpredictable. And I think that's why, the veto, an equivalent of, essentially a political equivalent of a nuclear force is not something that we can rely on now. And that, of course, raises the question of whether the entire UN system and the system of the Security Council is in any way really there to protect global peace and security the way it was meant to be. But putting this issue aside, I do think, and that's my main line of work right now, I do think that real avenues for accountability exist, and in some cases they can create and should create deterrence. As you know, the International Criminal Court has already opened the case. Just mentioning in parenthesis that the preliminary investigation has been going on for 8 years. So potentially it probably could have been opened earlier, but that aside, it's open. And it's, very symbolic that 39 countries made sure that helped the prosecutor of the criminal court make it quick. Every day, almost every day, every week, we hear about a new country opening national prosecutions under so-called concept of universal jurisdiction, which allows them to go after foreign nationals and crimes that have nothing to do with the country per se, just because the crimes are so horrendous that this concept allows them to launch these prosecutions. There is a case in the International Court of Justice where the decision is expected shortly. There are interim measures, injunction essentially, issued by the European Court of Human Rights, and so on and so forth. So there is an incredible, I would say, action going on the legal side of things. And of course, in some ways, yes, it will take years to get any of the perpetrators to justice through these processes. But I do think, I'm absolutely convinced that when such processes start while the bullets are still flying, they do help to stop them. And it may not happen overnight, but it does. The more serious it is, the closer we get to naming the perpetrators, to formulating the indictments as opposed to just a general condemnation, the more people, the more soldiers and generals who participate in this action would think twice before pulling the trigger. And call me idealistic, but I do think that at this point, this is one of the most important things we can do.
Thank you so much for that input. Vava, if you're with us, I would like to come to you next, because just hearing Dr. Neustadt talk, one can imagine hearing that and some of the legal mechanisms and processes that have been put in place, and just watching events unfold as they have in Europe. I have to imagine this has given you a bit of a sense of deja vu. Your home country is long accustomed to foreign meddling and intervention. Is the Congo a cautionary tale here? And what has been done, perhaps by you and your fellow human rights activists in the country and in the region, to rein in or otherwise prevent autocratic leaders in Congo's neighboring states from causing havoc in your home country?
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you to everyone at the Resist Bureau. I'm incredibly excited to be joining you, and thank you to all those who have joined us today. The first thing I have to say, as one of those people that have been that had become a refugee, have been displaced by dictatorship and conflict and poverty, my solidarity stand with the Ukrainian people. To all of you I send you my affections, my love, my support, my solidarity, and in whichever way possible that we can help, in whichever part of the world where we are, we would be standing with you, we would be supporting you. Now, we need to address the elephant in the room. When did this start? No, it did not start with Crimea, it did not start with Chechnya, it did not start with Georgia. It did not even start with when Putin was elected in 2000. This, arguably, from a historical perspective, maybe started in 1989. And from that perspective, Francis Fukuyama was wrong when he talked about the end of history in 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall was perhaps the beginning of another conflict. And we are now beginning to witness potentially the crisis which the fall of the Berlin Wall unleashed. And with China and Russia regaining more and more influence and becoming more and more assertive, we are now living some of those consequences. And it's not, this is interesting because when you look at the recent elections of the UN General Assembly, in a continent of 54 people in Africa, I think about 23 countries only voted for standing in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. That says a lot. In a continent which has witnessed a lot of invasions, a lot of conflicts, a lot of meddling from Western countries, to only have about 23 countries voting to stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people, it's really telling. Now, from an African perspective, and this has to be explained quite clearly, from an African perspective, what Putin is doing in Ukraine, it's not very different from what, let's say, the British or the French or the American have done in Africa. It's absolutely no different. We see virtually no much difference at all. We see the same behavior. The reason here, arguably one can argue, perhaps the West seems to be really angry, or I should be more precise here, liberal democracies in the West seems to be really angry because Putin is doing the same thing which liberal democracy does in non-white countries. And that is a fact. And that has to be spoken about quite clearly. If Putin had invaded, let's say, non-white people, or had supplied or financed or supported the killings of non-white people, the way Putin did in Syria, we did not see the kind of sanctions that we are now seeing when Putin had finally decided to commit the same crimes he had been committing in Syria against fellow white people in Europe. And that has to be we need to be quite clear when it comes to those facts. And you see that across the board. Even when it comes to refugees, you see the same countries in Europe that were incredibly angry, refusing to welcome or to accept any refugee, whether it was from North Africa with the people crossing through the seas, or whether it was from Syria, people coming through Turkey and so on and so forth. Those same countries in Europe that refuse to accept any refugees have opened their doors wide and opened to refugees from Ukraine. And what's the difference? The key difference here between refugees that were coming from Syria, from Africa, and refugees coming from Ukraine, as some of the journalists have alluded to, is simply because refugees coming from Ukraine are white, and some of us were black or colored or different colors of things. So when it comes, I'm going to come to the Congolese question. I just wanted to set this in because it's really crucial that when we're having this conversation, that we are being honest to one another, that we are being honest with the truth, with fact on the ground. So the massive difference here, or the key element here, is the behavior which Putin is demonstrating in Ukraine is the same behavior which Western democracy have been doing in Africa and across the world since independence. Congo is a perfect example. The British or the French or the American have not sent military troops or military boots in Congo, but they have funded militia gangs directly or indirectly through people like Paul Kagame that are responsible for the killings of around maybe 6 million Congolese people. No one in the world says a word. There has been virtually almost no sanctions against Kagame or against these people. So it's really, really telling, and perhaps I'm hopeful. I have to be an optimistic. That maybe the current situation in Crimea, it's going to eventually change perspective and views in Europe. That maybe going forward, the West would all of a sudden stop supporting brutal leaders, people that Barack Obama called strong men in Africa, people who were created by the Cold War and which continue to be supported by militia gangs by the West, and they're continuing to retain their power using militia gangs across Africa. When we talked about the Great Lakes region, and when you look at the Great Lakes region, essentially almost every single leader in that part of the world is one, a former warlord responsible for brutal atrocities, and virtually almost every single one of them has been supported, funded by the West. And all of them have been responsible for the killings of countless of people in Africa. And especially in my own country in Congo. Think of Museveni in Uganda. Museveni in Uganda, even in spite of stealing the last elections, he's refusing around £2 billion or $2 billion from Western countries. Think of Paul Kagame in Rwanda, in spite of funding dozens of militia gangs in Congo, from RCD Goma to CNDP to M23 to all the different militia gangs. Paul Kagame continued to receive fund and money from the West. Think of people like Denis Sassou Nguesso in Congo Brazzaville. He has been in power for nearly 35 or 40 years now. He's still receiving support and funding from the French. Think of Gabon. Think of the entire Great Lakes region. You have men in power who are responsible for some of the West atrocities, each of them receiving support from the West. And yet here you have the same West responsible for funding and supporting the killings and the development in Africa, all of a sudden standing against Putin. But guess what? In my opinion, one can easily argue from a historical perspective that Putin not only is doing what the West has been doing in Africa, but actually Putin has been learning from what the West has been doing in Africa. And Putin is, the West are perhaps angry at Putin now because Putin is committing the same atrocities which they have been committing in Africa and across the world here in Europe. And that's really, really telling now. We have to talk about solution. I don't want to, continue screaming on this subject. Now, the solutions. Short term, the key word, which is the one element I've been, screaming about, it's justice. Impunity has to be brought to an end. Okay, the only way that we can create a sustainable peace is by holding those responsible for atrocities, for the violation of international human rights, violation of international norms accountable. So justice, that is a short term, and that justice also could potentially also mean, in my opinion, going to the route of the international criminal justice, to the ICC and so forth. But that's the short term. Long term, and we have to be honest to one another, the long-term change that we, all of us, locally, nationally, and internationally need is decolonization. The West continue to behave, and when I say the West, let me be precise, let me use an activist language. White people, white Christian people continue to behave in a very colonial mindset, continue to look at many parts of the world, in Africa especially, as almost as their subordinate, continue to fund militia gangs, continue to support brutal leaders responsible for the killings as well as the looting of our natural resources. And until white people stop behaving in a colonial mindset, we are screwed. Because guess what? In the same way that, the thing about brutality is you can, once someone starts practicing their brutality against colored people, against black people, eventually they'll use their brutality, guess what? Against fellow white people. We have seen it with Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany started first practicing their brutality in Southern Africa. And guess what happened in the 1939, in the 1930s and 1940s? Eventually, their brutality was exported and expressed or put in action here in Europe. And we are seeing it with Putin. He started his brutality or perfected his brutality in Syria, and now he's doing it here in Ukraine. And until white people are able to decolonize, we are screwed as a people. That's in a nutshell, that's my introduction.
Thank you so much, Vava. That was very extensive. And I think the one thing that keeps coming up from Dr. Anya to your presentation is the idea that in a lot of instances, the atrocities that we see today have been long coming. So somehow, like you mentioned already, that there's been so much of the same behavior that has been reinforced in some way culture of impunity, but also you gave recommendations on what should be done and what can be done that can break that cycle. So Godba, I would like to bring you into the conversation because you're also an expert in the Great Lakes region, which has experienced untold misery on account of multiple military interventions. Has the silence of the world leaders emboldened authoritarian leaders in the same way that Western inaction may have encouraged Putin to think he could invade and decimate Ukraine without serious consequences?
Thank you, Matante. Thank you, Jeff, and colleagues. Just let me, in respect of the questions that you've raised, let me just raise a couple of points. One is that we need to, first of all, appreciate that the issues that we are confronted with today, right from Ukraine and Russia to the African continent, are essentially the incompleteness of the end of the Cold War. Because at the end of the Cold War, we had a bipolar world divided between East and West. And normally what happened was that every country was either aligned to the West, that's the America and the East, which was Russia. Now there's a group of countries which were mainly in Africa and the rest of the developing world that considered themselves non-aligned, and we had the non-aligned movement. So at the end of the Cold War, we basically were hoping to get a multipolar world where you have different power centers, and therefore alignment would not be necessarily useful. And we've seen efforts being made across the world where dominant forces have been able to gain spheres of influence. If you look at the last 2 decades, Africa has been basically more or less like the playground for these spheres of influence. So that's why you have almost all the powers, China, US, UK, Russia, India, Israel, Turkey, all of them hold what they call Africa summits. And the Africa summits are really an extension of these powers as they build their influence. In the process, what do we see? In the process, what we see is that on the African continent, the countries that were beginning to democratize, they begin to actually pull backwards because they basically start playing the games of the Western world. So in effect, the failure of the end of the Cold War, or the failure of the end of the Cold War, created an incentive for some of the long-serving leaders on the African continent to find ways of surviving beyond what their constitutions are provided. So all the leaders who have been long-serving, the late Mugabe, Kagame in Rwanda, Museveni in Uganda, even until recently, El Bashir in Sudan, Obiang Nguema in Equatorial Guinea, Biya in Cameroon, they all play the game of the West. So I wouldn't even say that the silence of the superpowers, of the great powers, or the Western leaders is the one that is perpetuating some of the human rights abuses and the democratic reversals that we're experiencing. On the contrary, there is a convergence of interests between all these powers, whether they are Western powers or Russia aligned, all of them, there is a confluence of these powers and African leaders, especially the African dictators on this continent. They are dictators who have been in power for now up to 40 years. Some of them 3 decades, 2 decades, but essentially they have there's a convergence between Western leaders who are shifting and looking for business opportunities for their companies. They are trying to undercut Russia and China, and therefore they can really not push for the kind of values of democracy, of rule of law, of respect for human rights, of freedom. They can't push for those values because their paramount interest is to beat China and Russia and other countries like Turkey in the game of what you would look at as the new colonialism or the new colonization of Africa. So there is really a convergence between all of these. At this moment, you realize one of the countries that has had extensive outreach in Africa is Russia. Right from Egypt, I think Russia has been constructing a $29 billion nuclear power plant, and from there, Russia has signed either through its national nuclear energy company, Rostam. It has signed either nuclear power projects to build nuclear plants across the continent, or has framework agreements to be able to develop nuclear energy resources, right from across all the countries, including Uganda. Now, of course, Uganda and other countries need nuclear energy, but you see, the countries like Russia will take this as an opportunity, because it cannot compete on other areas. Then it looks for areas of influence, nuclear technology being one of them. You've seen China taking more of the infrastructure projects. So the point I want to make is that the growth of dictatorship on the African continent is really a product of the convergence of the West and the East in terms of establishing spheres of influence on the African continent. I would want to rest it there for the time being.
Thank you so much, Godber. We have a few minutes before we turn this over to some questions we have for Rula, but I'd love to get your thoughts really quickly, if you could, because you brought up something very important and Vava brought up something very important in his comments as well. And one of the interesting dynamics of recent weeks has been, to your point, to Vava's point, the mixed response of some African governments and communities to the Ukraine crisis. And while we've seen a lot of support for the Ukrainian people, there's also a suspicion of Western claims to be standing up for democracy and freedom there. In some cases, this has been driven by concern about the racism that we've seen shown to Africans trying to escape Ukraine, and in others. And it's been driven by the fact that the Russian government, as you were just pointing out, provides much support to African states, including arms and security and military assistance. Do you think, really quickly, in a minute or two, do you think it's true that these claims that the West has lost its moral authority over the last decade? And how much does that matter in this context? It would be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so first of all, you can't say that there is an African response to the Ukrainian situation because the Africa can hardly speak as a unit. What we've seen across the board, whether they are matters to do with Africa, whether they are to do with international relations and international law, the African countries hardly speak with one voice. Or the attempts to have one voice within the framework of the African Union have not been very productive, because Africa probably has the most diverse character of leaders. That some of the leaders don't even talk to each other. Others, they are different generations apart. So having the African Union cannot, has failed to be the platform that crystallizes a common voice that represents African position. That's why you can sharply contrast the voting of Kenya in the United Nations Security Council vis-a-vis the response of many African countries or the African leaders as far as the situation in Ukraine is concerned. Secondly, quite a good number of these countries have been developing those relations with Russia, and I don't think that they are in a hurry to disrupt their relations with Russia simply because of a country that is so many miles away called Ukraine, because the African countries really do not think in terms of long-term strategic international relations across the world. Most of the conflicts have been here in Africa. You find African countries basically conflicting with each other here. Thirdly, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is one of the most blatant violations of international law. It's the most blatant violations of the United Nations Charter, and all the principles of sovereignty and statehood as we know them in international law. Now, but when you look at the response in Africa, you realize that it is so diverse. A lot of it is muted. A lot of the communications about state responses by very junior officers of state or government, and therefore you can hardly attribute any specific positions to this government. Finally, the Western leaders, one of the challenges that we have is that the situation that is happening in Ukraine has also happened in Africa in many different ways. The difference between what has been happening on the African continent and Ukraine is that the violence, brutality, and the destruction in Ukraine is being perpetrated by Russia, which is another power. In Africa, normally the violence against African peoples is by the same governments that are supposed to protect them. And when this happens, Western nations, Western leaders normally watch, or they basically make muted statements of disapproval. So really, you'll find that there is a big cross-section of Africans, ordinary African peoples, and the elite, that actually, even to a degree, they are even excited about what Russia is doing in Ukraine, simply because they think that Russia is getting back on America. So a lot of the support you see in African public opinion is not so much because the African public opinion is supporting Ukraine, sorry, but it is because they are opposed to America. So that's what you see in some of the discourse that you see on the continent. The support for Russia is really more because of the hatred of America than the approval of what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
Thanks very much, Godber. Really insightful comments, and I know we'll delve into this topic a bit more at the end of the show in our Q&A. But I really want to turn over to Rula, if you're still with us. You know, I've seen you, and as I'm sure others have, you've been very outspoken on social media and elsewhere for a number of years, even before the invasion of Ukraine, raising the issue of Putin's war crimes across the world. You have denounced the weakness, especially of international organizations such as the UN, which we've delved into a bit today, for failing to hold him and his allied dictators like Syria's Assad, for example, accountable. So my question to you would be, you know, given your criticism and given are institutions like the UN simply outdated? Are they ill-equipped to deal with these modern realities? And if so, what institutional reforms exist, or what would you propose that might turn the tide against dictators like Putin and those like him?
So just to realize that whoever been following dictatorship or studying authoritarianism that's been on the rise for decades, been warning the world that what's happening in Syria or in Yemen or elsewhere is not going to stay there. It's sooner or later coming back to haunt all of us. We've seen the first wave of radicalization, the first wave of massive refugee crisis, the rise of anti-immigration sentiments, and also we saw how dictators build coalition and access of autocrats. So for example, when Bashar al-Assad inherited the presidency from his father, he activated what we call, whoever studied Syria and the Middle East, the Hama rule. In 1982, his father, Hafiz al-Assad, bombed to oblivion a city called Hama, killing 40,000 people, obliterated the whole city. They left corpses in the street to send a message to everybody: never dare to rise up against the regime. But also from that moment on, we saw countries around the Middle East building military ties or a bridge to their Western backers. For example, Saudi Arabia built that with the United States. Egypt did it with the United States. Assad did it, father and son, with Russia. And the whole geostrategic goal is not to defend them against invasion from the outside. It's actually to help them in a case of a D-Day. And a D-Day for them was when the majority would rise up against the ruling minority, which is the kleptocratic, autocratic, corrupt dictator. And that's precisely what happened in 2011. Actually, today is the 11th anniversary of the genocide in Syria. And we saw how the world failed the Syrian people, didn't care. Somehow the whole idea that they were Muslims, they were somehow viewed with suspicion, so they refused to intervene. And now they're realizing that their failure to intervene in Syria or in Yemen or in Libya effectively and standing up to their democratic value, they opened the door, they emboldened the butcher in Moscow to do what he's doing in Ukraine. If you look at pictures of Aleppo, you look at picture of Hama in the 80s, you look at picture of Grozny, it is the same thing. You look at pictures today of Mariupol or Kyiv and other areas, you will realize that they're following exactly the same strategy. The Hama rule is being implemented in the heart of Europe. So when we talk about the United Nations, it's not only in the United Nations, it's the whole system that was built post-World War II that is not effective enough to prevent genocide. And it all starts with propaganda and corruption. When Putin was waging a war in Syria, simultaneously he was bankrolling autocrats and far-right leaders in Europe, Farage in the UK, Salvini in Italy, Marine Le Pen in France, every far-right movement around Europe, so they can incite hate against refugees, Syrian refugees precisely. When Donald Trump was elected, he called Syrian refugees snakes, rapists, criminals, terrorists. He put a ban on Muslims, remember that? So we can see this coalition is aiding and abetting each other. They defended even Mohammed bin Salman after he slaughtered a journalist. So it's a wake-up call what's happening today. Do we want to continue with this love affair with these dictators, looking at because we depend obviously in the name of oil, and gas and weapon sales. In the name of that, are we continuing to sell our democratic values to the highest bidder, to the highest dictator? But by doing that, we're opening the door for future Ukraine wars and genocide and atrocities to continue. So I think one of the reasons that I am really frustrated is I advise multiple leaders, especially, for example, President Macron during the G7 in 2018, 2019. And I told him explicitly that, the relationship with dictators, it's a liability. You cannot appease a monster in the hope that he will not eat you. Sooner or later, he's coming back to eat you. I've been advising leaders around the world, wherever I meet them, whether in Italy, in France, in Europe, in the United States, against being in bed with dictators. The ultimate price is going to be paid by millions of people with blood and soil, with entire cities crushed to the ground. This is a fight between dictatorship and tyranny, and there's no neutrality in that space. I hope whatever world comes out on the other side of this war in Ukraine will be a world that is truly committed to democratic values. Alternatively, Ukraine will be one of the first wars in a long, maybe century wars in Europe and everywhere.
Thank you so much, Rila, for these extensive submissions. Something that I would love for you to fit into before we move into the Q&A session is the idea that we've spoken extensively about the role of external actors. We've mentioned the UN and other institutions. Where do we place the role of the citizen, the average citizen, in ensuring that they hold accountable those that are responsible for enabling dictators?
Listen, I remember when in Syria and in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, when the Arab Spring started, they started with roses, with people holding roses. And Putin and Assad answer was bullet, tanks, barrel bombs, starvation, mass torture, mass genocide. So if the international community decide, never mind, or somehow turn a blind eye, what you're emboldening these dictators to continue their reign of terrors globally. So as much as I believe in citizenship, we need to be as organized effectively as these dictators are. Because guess what? When Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince dictator, say that they can buy anybody in the West, that they can bankroll them, they're spot on. For so far, they bought in basically their own immunity. They bought access. They legitimized their own murderous dictatorship in the eyes of citizens in the United States and around the world, where people somehow thought that Mohammed bin Salman was really a reformist somehow, even as if he was mass beheading hundreds of people in his country. He was bombing schools and bridges and farms in Yemen. It didn't matter because he thought that he bought politicians, powerful politicians in the West. So we have a corruption issue. We have these dictators who know and understand the weakness of the West, and they're exploiting that. And that's why citizens have to be as effective in holding these people feet to the fire and exposing their corruption. I admire our colleagues, journalists, who are doing an amazing job around the world. I mean, one of the reasons why we have journalists in the Middle East telling our colleagues in the West what these dictators are doing. And most of the time they're dismissed as emotional or impartial. We need to bypass that rule and understand that actually these are the people who are risking their lives to warn us what is to come. Because it starts with persuasion, propaganda, and then genocide. We've seen it, historically, and we've seen it again. So when Mohammed bin Salman goes to the Atlantic, the magazine, and send a mafia message to President Biden, I think it's our duty as citizens in the East and in the West to warn, to decodify his language. What is he really trying to say versus what is he really doing? And we need to pay attention to what he's doing. And I endorse electing as many people. I believe in change, meaning I believe that politicians who've been there in office for many years, they are more prone to corruption and to stagnation. We need really to change this class of leadership and replace them with younger and younger and younger people who have at heart these democratic values.
Thank you very much, Rula, for your insights and for your passion. I think we can all agree that this world would be a better place if we had more like you out there speaking to these issues. I could continue this conversation forever, but what we want to do now quickly to end this program and for this portion of the program is to turn the discussion over to our colleague, Nick Cheeseman, and today's discussant, who's been waiting very patiently, Sarah Leah Whitson. Thank you for being patient to get their expert insights and also to check in on our WhatsApp to see what questions we have received from you, the audience. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and great discussion so far, everybody. I'm going to pass over to Sarah in just a second, but I want to just remind all of our panelists today that I've put the questions I'm going to be posing to them that have come in from people all over the world in the chat. So check the chat now and you can get a bit of a preview of the questions I'm going to be throwing over to you in just a minute. Now, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you Sarah Whitson now. She's the Executive Director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN, an organization that seeks to highlight and celebrate democratic reforms in the Arab world. Previously, she served as a regional director, executive director at Human Rights Watch, and she's also a prolific writer, analyst, and tireless democracy advocate. Sarah, it's a great pleasure for us to have you with us. And before I go blundering in with some of my thoughts, I'd love to throw the floor over to you and just ask you, first of all, for your own comments, but also for your responses to some of the things that you've heard today. What struck you about the discussion so far? So I think you're on mute.
What about now?
Perfect.
All right, sorry. I think hearing from the commentators, it's hard not to observe that this is a moment of global realignment where the West, particularly Europe and the United States, are really trying to drum up support for Russia's brutal invasion and brutal bombardment of Ukraine, but it's facing challenges. And we are seeing nearly every country in the world trying to figure out how to position itself. And then of international law, human rights, and so forth, that the West is now clinging to, don't have the resonance they should. And part of the reason for that, is some of the speakers have alluded to, is countries that are now calling for the entire global community to rise up in defense of international norms, against wars of aggression, against changing boundaries by force, in respect of human rights and international humanitarian law, have not been doing a very, very good job at respecting those laws and norms themselves. And so you can see someone like Putin saying, oh, you want me to respect international law? It's clear that Putin and this war in Ukraine didn't start yesterday, that they have been a long belligerence and aggressive and awful action by Putin. But these sorts of actions also didn't start with Putin. Believes that he can get away with this because he has seen how the United States how the United States is still supporting the unlawful invasion of Saudi Arabia, of Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And what's more is, as the United States tries to find more countries to support its sanctions against Russia, as the United States is now trying to do, for example, in Saudi Arabia, what these dictators are literally is with more crimes. So Saudi Arabia is saying to the United States, if you want us to increase oil output, to reduce the price of oil and thereby support the war against Russia and Ukraine, then you have to help us commit more war crimes in Yemen. So we have this very strange situation where we are being asked to support saving the children of Ukraine by bombarding and massacring more children in Yemen. It just doesn't add up. And I think this war, more than any other right now, a dramatic global cost of the erosion of international laws and norms that the United States has been spearheading in many parts of the world. And now we are paying the cost because we can't muster the global support that we want for Putin's war against Ukraine.
Thanks. Now I'm going to ask you a question, Sarah, which I'm going to throw to some of our panelists in a minute, which is, we've heard from a lot of our panelists a lot of anger, and I've just, before I joined this conversation, I was on Facebook, and Charles Maynard, I'm going to give you a shout out. He's giving me a very hard time. challenging, questioning, accusing, raising, some good issues about Western hypocrisy. And I think one of the things that we often face, and I'm sure this is something you face as well, Sarah, is that we're sometimes interpreted as a spokesperson for Western countries, which in fact we're often a critic of. And so I think it's important to make it clear that this show and we are not that, and we're very critical of the Western approach, both in Russia and elsewhere historically, as I think this show has brought out. But I do think we kind of want to make sure that we don't throw out, sort of, as it were, democracy and human rights with the Western bathwater. We recognize that people are genuinely angry about Western hypocrisy. And I think there's an instinct in some parts of the world that, well, Putin's kind of sticking it to the West. Maybe that's a good thing because the West deserves a bit of a kicking. And I understand that because of the way that the West has operated, as you and others have said, because of the way that, for example, Bush and Trump operated, because of the way that Boris Johnson has operated. It's a reasonable sort of sense and reflex for people to have. And I think one of the jobs that we can perhaps play is to say, that's totally legitimate, but let's not let that actually take us towards some kind of support for Putin or some kind of equivalency of war crimes or some kind of letting down of the international solidarity. And similarly, it is true that we are seeing horrendous acts of racism within Ukraine against Africans, and these need to be called out in the strongest terms by everybody involved. But again, that does not mean that we should then fall into the trap of supporting Putin. So one of the things I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to throw some of this back to some of the panelists as well in a moment, is how do we do that? How do we build that kind of cross-national network of people that can say, we don't buy what the West narrative is in all of these cases, but neither are we going to fall into the trap of siding with Putin. We're going to take a different position, which is that we have a set of principles we want applied more consistently. How do we go about building that kind of network and that kind of message?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's a bit of a straw man that there are people who are criticizing Western hypocrisy or double standards are falling into a trap of supporting Putin. I have not seen that anywhere. It is a caricature that's been used. That at this moment in time, people who are showing in which part of the reason why we are in the bind that we are in today is because we contributed to the erosion of international norms and international laws. The retort is to be called a tanky. And in years past, criticizing American support for abusive apartheid regimes in the Middle East led people to call one Assad supporters, or Hezbollah supporters, or Hamas supporters, or Mullahs and Iran supporters. So I think it's a common strawman tactic to silence critics of Western policy, but I haven't actually seen anybody supporting Putin. I think it's also important that we avoid exceptionalizing Russia's war or war crime in Ukraine. There is nothing unique or extraordinary about Russia's war crimes in Ukraine, very, very sadly. And in fact, we can see parallels, equal parallels across the board to what US-backed dictatorships, US-backed apartheid governments have been doing and are doing right now in the Middle East and North Africa. Do you think 7 years of starvation of the Yemeni people with air, land, sea blockade is not at least equal to or equally bad as what Russia is doing? You think the indiscriminate bombardment of homes, schools, hospitals, clinics in Yemen is somehow less bad than the bombardment of Russia? It's not. It's all bad. The challenge we have is that our government representatives have lost the credibility, have lost our trust, because they have contributed and are contributing to, as we speak at this moment in time, not just 20 years ago, but now, today, on the erosion of international laws and norms. And I think you put your finger on what we need. We need a transnational civil society movement that will bridge the gaps between people who stand for democracy, who stand for human rights in a way that is universalist, in a way that respects all of the rights of people around the world, not just people whom they are particularly partisan to or feel sympathetic for.
Thanks, Lots. I do think there is, in some countries, I think there is some significant, I wouldn't necessarily say call it support for Putin, but certainly I'm on social media and people are defending Putin and Putin's actions. So it is out there. It's definitely out there. It's not just questioning of the West. In some cases, I've seen quite a lot of people defending Putin and defending his actions and questioning whether or not the West triggered the conflict, and then partly using that as a way to excuse what Putin's doing. And of course, the wash on social media right now is massive disinformation campaigns, which are being waged from many countries, many of which are actually on Putin's side or pushing pro-Putin messages. And many of those individuals, sadly, are in Western countries. In fact, one of the things we know from recent research is that there's been a big crossover, bizarrely, from coronavirus and COVID-19 fake news disinformation campaigns to pro-Putin disinformation campaigns. So this is something that is happening in the West. And I think we do need to think about it. Certainly on message boards I've been on in the last few days with people from around the world, all have had people, at least some of whom have been expressing pro-Putin views. So as we move to the Q&A, guys, I'd love you to take on board some of those thoughts and discussions we just had. I'm going to race through the questions because we're sadly running out of time. But I'm going to come to you quickly and hopefully you can give us sort of fairly focused responses. So Anna, the question we have for you, again, these are questions that have come in from around the world. They're not mine. They've come in on WhatsApp. Is to what extent did the West encourage the Ukraine to move towards Europe and NATO without putting in place measures to protect Ukraine? How culpable is the West in the situation that has emerged?
Okay. I'm afraid that's not a question I can answer in just a few minutes. In short, I don't think there is a straight answer to that. What does encouragement mean? Even if it did, was there anything particularly wrong with that? I think particularly with the EU integration, I don't see anything particularly wrong with either Ukraine wanting to do that or the West encouraging it. I do think that in many ways, the NATO expansion is an excuse that Russia has been using for decades now. It really has very little to do with Ukraine to explain some of its actions elsewhere. And the other question is when the question is the West hasn't done enough to put in place measures to protect Ukraine. I'm just not entirely sure what is being referred to here, or what could the West have done to protect Ukraine. I mean, the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine and the agreement that was signed back then was kind of the promise that the West relied on by Russia, which was, of course, brutally violated, as we all can see. But I do think that, I think partially the reaction of the West right now that we're seeing is the reflection of this sense of responsibility that is felt there. If I may add just one point while I have the floor in response to many of the comments here, which I think is one kind of big piece of the equation that we're forgetting here is Russia's civil societies, the Russians, right? Whom, part of the world is blaming for everything that's happening in Ukraine. The other part of the world is trying to, justify and explain that Putin is not Russians and Russia is not its military and regime and all of that. But I think it goes straight back to the comparison. I do think that in many ways, the comparison of Putin's action in Ukraine with with the actions of the US administration or any others is absolutely legitimate, except for this one point. In the US, you still can fairly freely express your disagreement with your government's policy. And in Russia, you simply cannot. And as somebody who was born in the Soviet Union, saw this country go through a massive, crumbling of this massive totalitarian system, have this quick but enormous period of democracy when it was actually possible, and going back to what it is now, I find it one of the most devastating things that I had to live through in my life. And it's really, this is a huge part of what is happening right now. And over the last 2 weeks, it has become from bad to worse so quickly that we are not even understanding fully what the Russian society is going to look like in a few weeks' time. And I think when we're thinking about what can be done, what should be the reaction, what are the comparisons that we're making, this is something that we do need to keep in mind.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think it's a really good point also to highlight the bravery of the people who are trying to stand up in Russia, news presenters, etc., who are trying to highlight some of this and taking on incredible personal risks themselves. So thank you for that. Vavo, coming to you now, I know you had some comments you wanted to make before, so we had to kind of keep the momentum going, but you've got the floor now to come back on some of those. And I wanted also, to ask you about your sense of, how do we deal with this conundrum of, on the one hand, recognizing Western hypocrisy, on the one hand, recognizing the West's involvement in crimes across the world, and at the same time, not losing sight of that solidarity to resist on a broader level. How do you think we can go about achieving that?
Thank you very much, Nick. I think that there is a number of things to put in context here. One, I suppose that one of the first things I want to say is, of all, of the many peoples across the world that have suffered from conflict, from oppressions and dictatorship and so on and so forth, African people have seen a huge, have had a documented experience of that. So our sympathy is definitely with the Ukrainian. But that's not to say that we are also not aware of the fact that Black people are not valued, or even if not to say hatred across the world. We know we are not valued by the West. History shows that over the last 400 years, from the dark years of slavery, transatlantic slavery, to colonization, to post-independence, the support of people like Mobutu in Congo and so on and so forth. We know we are not also valued in Ukraine. We've seen that by the way African people have been treated in Ukraine. We also know we are not valued in Russia. We've seen that by the way Russia supports dictatorship and supporting brutal regime across the continent. So amongst the African, I suppose one of, if I could speak on behalf of some of my fellow friends, I suppose it's not that we are, we stand against Russia's oppressions in Ukraine on principal reasons. Okay, and we are not supporting, we are not cheering for the West, also on principal reasons, because we know the West is essentially, screaming now because it's white people that are being killed, not because they're Black people. We know the situation in Yemen, which Rula has spoken about. We know about, situation in Syria, spoken about the situation in Commonwealth country and across the Great Lakes region and so on and so forth. So when you see African essentially keeping quiet or not, aligning with the West or screaming with the West, it's not because of any other reasons. It's because of those reasons. We know you guys don't like us. White people simply don't like us. That's a fact of the matter, and it's a fact we are, learning to live with. Now, moving from that perspective as well, another thing to keep in mind, for many white people, there is an idea of bipolarity. It's either you're with Russia or you're with the US. And this is the whole idea of where the idea of decolonization comes into effect. So you have many people across the continent who understand history, who are anti-Russian, who are against the invasion of Ukraine, but who are also not cheering for the West because of history, because of support of people like Kagame and Museveni and Mobutu in Congo and so on in Zaire and so on and so forth. So there is that element, and that links to one of the questions which Jeffrey asked before about the whole idea of the West losing its moral compass in Africa or across the world. And I was laughing when I heard that question because I'm not sure when, perhaps in Europe, perhaps in the US, but not in Africa. Not before the 1960s, before the wind of change, not after the wind of change, with support of brutal leaders like Mobutu and Museveni and all the other leaders across the continent responsible. I mean, this is really crucial to put this into perspective. Let me put this way, Nick. During the dark years of slavery, Africa is said to have lost around, give and take, 12 million people over the 200 or 300 years of slavery or transatlantic slavery. And of course, we know before transatlantic slavery, we know we had the Arab slave trade, and we know the recent pictures of Africans being sold as slaves in Libya, and the treatment of African people across the Middle East. Also, African people are not liked or enjoyed or valued across the Middle East. That's also another fact. But let's pop down the side. Now, during the dark years of slavery, we lost about 12 million Africans to transatlantic slavery. Now, over the first 50 years of post-independence Africa, Africa lost over 22 million people by my count through wars and conflicts supported, funded, armed by the West. And we you know, how do you expect people in Africa to be cheering for the British or the Americans, given the support we've offered to brutal leaders responsible for our killings in that continent? Also to pick up on one of the points which Godba was making before, we don't have a lot of leaders in Africa. What we have in majority are clients. We have client of the British state, we have client of the American state, we have client of the French, and so on and so forth. We have people who are essentially fighting, for attention of the West and willing to do A, B, C, D, and so forth. So when it comes to Africa, to conclude, it's not an issue of, I suppose many people in the West need to start thinking and discussing those issues from your local perspective, from your very personal or local perspective. You need to look at this from a global perspective. You need to dethrone yourself from the center of your world and just think about the West and Ukraine and Russia and so on and so forth. You also need to think about the way the West have behaved in places across Africa, across the Caribbean, across the Middle East. It would give you a better understanding of why some people across the world are simply standing aside. My applaud goes to the 23 African countries that stood up and voted for and voted with Ukraine at the UN General Assembly when the vote was held. That showed principles. I'm disappointed that a lot of people, a lot of countries in the continent, including South Africa, decided to essentially not to take a stand, to abstain, and a lot of few countries voted against. Only one African country voted against, I'm afraid. But crucially here, we cannot proceed. I think some people talked about building a transnational, civil society to support democracy and so forth. Congo is another perfect example. From independence in the 1960s to present, whenever the Congolese people vote for a leader, guess what? At every election, we've always had two votes. On one side, the Congolese people vote, and on the other side, Western countries vote. And the West have always won because we've never had the leaders that we've ever elected for. So in the 1960s, we elected for Lumumba. Guess what happened? He was killed. We ended up with Mobutu for 32 years of dictatorship, supported again by the West, which led people, and many people, including my family, to be displaced. And recently, a recent example, we voted for another person, Martin Fayulu. Guess what? The West decided to back up Felix Tshisekedi, who was placed in power by Joseph Kabila, who was in power for 18 years. So you have a country like Congo, which is at the heart of Western industrial revolutions and so forth. Over the last 6 years of independence, 32 years of dictatorship under Mobutu, 18 years of dictatorship under Kabila, and you have 20 years of conflict and killings and mass rape, supported by Western government. And then the question becomes, on what ground do you expect people like me, what is expressing and sending my love and affection to the Ukrainian people on moral and principle ground, to be cheering for the US? Because I know the West, the US, the same US government would also fund, or would continue to fund, the killings of my people.
Thanks, Vara. I think you made those points really eloquently and powerfully here, and hopefully this, Resistance Bureau show exists to allow some of these points to be made, and some of those conversations that you were just saying need to be had. And I think, one of the things that really struck me in the last couple of weeks is that, as part of the work I do, I've become painfully aware of the food shortages we now have in the Horn of Africa, where we have significant problems with poor rainfall and millions and millions of people who are likely to be in need of food. And the funds that have been started for that, for example, relief in countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, etc., are currently at about, I think, 5%. Mm-hmm. The funds that are being generated right now for Ukraine, I think, are probably going to be oversubscribed. So this question, that you have raised about, on the one hand, we want to be there for Ukraine so much solidarity, so much love, so much support, but it's perfectly reasonable to ask, if you're sitting in the Horn of Africa, why is your fund completely under-supported internationally when so much is being focused on Ukraine? And that inequality, I think, and as you say, I don't think people want to see less support for Ukraine. They just want to see the same level of support for all the other areas, right? It's not about leveling down. It's about leveling up and saying all of these are crises. They all deserve support and they deserve the same level of support. And until that happens, these questions will be asked and they will be legitimate questions. Now, Godber, I'm going to come to you next. And I would like to talk to you a little bit more about, so we're dealing here with dictators and authoritarian leaders around the world. I'd like to talk a little bit about Museveni, and we've had some questions in about, what are the international strategies that you would like to see placed against Museveni? We've talked about historically the West backing Museveni and being willing to tolerate manipulated elections. If the West was to take a stronger position, for example, as part of what might come out of the Ukraine crisis, which is a stronger position against authoritarian rule around the world, what could that look like? What were the sorts of strategies that you think might be successful and effective? Godber, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. And essentially, let me put it this way: that as of today, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So at this moment, the international community almost lost leverage with President Museveni, because the international community built up Museveni. Every time when there was an opportunity to be able to encourage him and his government to reform, to deepen economic reforms, to deepen democratic reforms, to deepen social reforms, the international community was outmaneuvered and almost deceived, because and partly because of the hypocrisy of the international community. They thought that they could always create a balance between their own interests and Museveni's interest. What they failed to acknowledge, it may be too late now, is that at the end of the day, the relationship that you need, what you need to build is more to do with the people, the population. So in Uganda right now, you have a strong power, strong concentration of power in the president, and the weakening of all institutions of state and institutions of civil society. Now, and this is normally how dictatorships are created, because dictators invest in dismantling and demobilizing citizens' institutions and state institutions. When a dictator has achieved that, you really have very little room for maneuver. And we've seen it across the African continent, that every time a leader develops the intention of overstaying in power, the last card they play is to play the racism card, is to play the colonialism card. So you'll find leaders like the late Mugabe, now President Museveni, and many others. They would, when the West asks you, we ask them about their democratic credentials. Basically, they say, "Oh, you are exhibiting colonial tendencies. You are racist," and we see that these countries, because of the point I raised earlier, that the West right now is in a race with China, with Russia, and with Turkey, because I don't consider Turkey really a Western democracy, because that's one of the, I think that's Russia, Turkey is a European dictatorship. It's a Western dictatorship under Erdogan. And so these countries are in the race for spheres of influence in Uganda, across the African continent. And to be honest, I can tell you that they have very limited leverage on what they can do with any of these dictators. Finally, let me make a last point, two last comments, that what we are seeing on the African continent, that we are seeing some young democracies of young leaders. I think that when the history of this continent is written 20 years from now, you are going to see a country like Kenya actually coming out as a hegemonic power, both economically and politically in the region, because I think that they are doing the right things in terms of building their democracy, building their public service, investing in education and infrastructure. I think I can see Ghana being one of the other beacons of hope on the continent. Of course, Botswana is a very small country. It may not have a strong influence like this too, but ultimately, I don't think that the West has any leverage right now on Museveni, because he also is very smart on playing them against each other. And I think you have to give to him, because President Museveni lives ahead all of them. And therefore, at the end of the day, the changes that happen in Uganda today can only be changes that are led by citizens. If there is any strategy that are supposed to be had, there must be investments in the citizens. But because of the race between Europe, the US, China, India, Russia, there is little room for maneuver for even the Western democracies to partner or to engage and support the Ugandan civil society and Ugandan citizens, because they will be beaten by China, Russia, and others in this race. So that's the way I would put it.
Thanks very much, Godber. And Rula, coming to you now. I like your response in general. You get the final word, so you can set the tone for the end of the conversation. We've also had an interesting comment just come in literally a couple of minutes ago on WhatsApp, wanting to ask you whether or not you think a more kind of feminist foreign policy and a feminist critique of power would be a good way to do some of the things we've been talking about in terms of building that international solidarity that would be both critical but also kind of taking a proactive position at the same time. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. So let me start with this quote that I love the most. If we only care about human rights abuses only when the enemy commits them, we really don't care about human rights, freedom, democracy. We do not. And as much as I love, listening to my colleagues and fellow activists in Africa and the Middle East in this moment, pointing to the West, to the failing of the West, I understand you. I feel your pain. I am ethnically Palestinian. I saw how refugees are treated. This is my work. I go to war zones. I've seen it all. I witnessed genocide after genocide, whether it's in Syria, in Yemen, in Bosnia. I've seen it, and I understand the failing of the West. But this is a moment where we need to build a stronger coalition of all humanists around the world and create a bridge with the West, with many voices in the West who protested for Black Lives Matter, who protested against Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu and their ethno-nationalism and Putin. We need to create really a bridge, a humanist bridge between East, Africa, West, everywhere, and have our voice heard, whether it's in DC, in Congress, whether it's at the African Union, whether at the European Parliament. We ultimately need to do this now, because our survival, all of us depend on it. And if women can play a major role, absolutely. I mean, if you look, for example, at the example of Liberia, what Eileen Johnson and Lima Gbode did, they ended the civil war. They organized, galvanized, mobilized. They elected a woman president, the first in her country. They won the Nobel Peace Prize and ended the civil war. I have no doubt that women approach is much more prone toward dialogue, compromise, a softer politics, and less of an ego, with all due respect, on steroid, like we're seeing with these murderous dictators. I mean, when I read that the Saudi dictator, when he was 17, he was sending bullets to judges. He's already telling you who he is. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. He's sending bullets to intimidate judges. Of course, he will end up, chopping up journalists in an embassy and bombing to oblivion other countries. We need to be aware of these people, but also, and with all due respect, who think the West is equivalent to what Putin is doing. And I see a lot of this rhetoric online. This is not only misguided, it's being used by Putin apologists and Assad apologists to perpetrate the idea that they're doing more, we're replicating what they did. Yes, the West did horrible things in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Palestine and Yemen. And I agree, they're still backing a lot of these dictators. But there's a moment of reckoning, and we need to help them reach an understanding that tyranny anywhere is a threat to democracy everywhere. And that's my final word.
Thanks very much. Very powerful final word. And I'm going to throw it back to you, Jeff and Mentali, to take us on. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nick, for leading that session. I mean, we could go on with this conversation because it keeps really getting better and better, but that is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to our audience for continuously engaging with our shows this past 2 years and for tuning in today. We hope to keep seeing you in the future. A special thank you to our incredible panel of experts for a job well done. This was a powerful discussion. The entire Resistance Bureau looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you, as well as spotlighting the great work that you do. For all the viewers that we have today, stay in touch with us by going to our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and subscribing to our updates on our homepage. Please follow us on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also visit our past shows, which are available on the YouTube channel, as well as on our website in the episode section. As a final note, the success of this program is testament to the collective effort of the entire Resistance Bureau team. A special shout out to our tech manager, Peter Dory, and to our creative director, Ndondom Sara, who are working behind the scenes to make this show the success that it continues to be. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again in our future shows. Thank you.